Welcome to Spiritual Naturalism Today, a conversation on science, nature, and spirituality. Our program is sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society with host Daniel Strain.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniel Strain, and I'm here with my co-host Lee Anderson.
Hello.
And Thomas Schenk.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about dealing with anxiety, worry, and fear. And we were talking just now about how this is, I think, a very relevant topic. And so it's something that maybe can be an inspiration for a lot of people as to why they might seek out contemplative practices. Before we get started, I wanted to make a little bit of an announcement. We have had a Twitter page for a long time, but we've got a lot of different social media pages, but we're most active on Facebook. We have been most active on Facebook. And recently we've begun a Reddit page, and so we plan to have a lot of active conversations on Reddit. And even though we've had Twitter for a while, we haven't been very active on there due to limited volunteer time to do that. But I wanted to let you all know that our Twitter page is now going to be a lot more active than it has been in the past. We're going to be putting out not only announcements of things like this podcast and articles and things, but also various commentary and little quick types of input and sharing that you wouldn't get normally from just the newsletter or just the blog and what have you. So if you are on Twitter, feel free to follow us there. You can go to our website at snsociety.org, and it'll be in the upper right-hand corner, a link to it. Or you can go to twitter.com/spiritual NATSOC. So, our topic today, dealing with anxiety, worry, and fear. Lee, one of the things you said just before we got started was a really great point about how anxiety might be more common for some people than fear, especially maybe younger people. But I was thinking that as people get older, maybe fear starts to be something that is addressed because people have children, and then they become fearful that something might happen to their children because that's a really big, attachment kind of thing. And then later in life, people start to have worries about death, and then of course there's money issues and all kinds of things. So maybe one of the things we could talk about is how these things come into play at different stages of life.
Yeah, when I was thinking about the topic itself, I was remembering when you're, late teens, early 20s, when you're getting through college, of course, you have a lot of anxiety associated with making the grade and living up to expectations. Then you get out in the world on your own, and you're kind of, most of the time, you know what's expected of you, but you don't know how to get there. So there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. And I remember during those times at that age thinking, I'll be so glad when I get older and I, get past all this anxiety stuff and everything. And I think what I've come to discover is that maybe there's not less anxiety, but the way that I deal with it is different as I've gotten older or so. So if I could go back to my, 20-year-old self and kind of give some advice about the anxiety, being anxious, and worrying about things. And anxiety to me can even be associated with kind of happy events. It doesn't have to be something that, you're worried about, but even anticipation sometimes kind of sets up anxiety in people too. And everyone hears that, it's an emotion, it's something invisible, it's not physical, but the symptoms that it manifests are physical themselves. And I really have come to discover, at least for me, that meditation, is basically the best way to deal with it. And I don't think it's ever going to go away for anyone, but with a lot of the thought processes having to do with meditation, I've learned how to at least handle it. Now, I know some people, and I even have this problem too, where I wake up in the middle of the night, like waking up from a dream, and anxiety hits me. And since, I have a watch now that measures my heart rate anytime I want to look at it, I see the physical symptoms there of that anxiety. And still, you do have to keep in mind that your mind itself is what's directing that, even though it is a physical symptom. So your mind is, the way to alleviate it. So again, meditation, is what I've seen is one of the best ways for getting past it.
Thomas, any opening thoughts on your end on this topic?
Well, the first thing, I think when we talk about fear and anxiety, that I'm not sure that there's not some definitions that we need. I think of anxiety as, fear is very specific. You can identify, this is causing me fear. But I think there's a kind of anxiety that is much more unspecific. It's like I had a period in my life when I was very stressed on a job, and I started waking up in the middle of the night feeling this pain in my heart. And at first I thought I had a physical problem, and it was only because my wife had quite a bit of experience with anxiety and panic attacks that I was able to recognize that this was anxiety and not, possibly some kind of a heart condition. And, and it got me to change jobs, because I said to myself, any job that makes you feel like you're having wake up in the middle of the night feeling like you're dying is not a job worth having. So there's a kind of, there's that kind of, I'd call it like clinical anxiety, which is, I think you can address that with meditative techniques, but I think it can be strong enough for some people that they really need, clinical help. And I think that's a distinction that people have to figure out, whether they can deal with anxiety on their own or whether they really need, I think it's really unfortunate how many people are on Xanax and all kinds of antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication. I think a lot of people could learn how to function without those, but there definitely is a place, people who just have this at a level where they need professional help. So I think that's a little distinction that we need to make. And it's kind of unfortunate there aren't words that, we could use two different levels of anxiety that we really can deal with, and anxiety that is, as I say, clinical. Maybe we should just call it clinical anxiety. And
y'all's opening comments here have already illustrated to me, as I'm making notes of all these branches in the conversation and ways that we could go with this. And this is really a vast topic, because there's so many things about it. You could almost just have a podcast just about this. But I think, first of all, that's a great point about the issue of medications. What I've noticed is that whenever you bring up these kinds of concerns to someone who is on a particular type of medication for these things, there's a defensiveness, and it's not necessarily their fault. It's often the fault of the communicator in maybe sounding, unsympathetic, or sounding ignorant of their condition, or sounding like they're too judgmental or something like that. But surely, yes, there is an important place for the medications in the right ways and right times. But what I think is happening is that a lot of people are missing an opportunity to really experience the immense power of these philosophical and these spiritual practices and these kinds of contemplative practices. I think a lot of people don't really understand just how powerful they can be. And studies have shown that they can be as powerful. And so I would just invite people to give them a try, not to forego any medication they're supposed to take or anything like that. We obviously aren't doctors. We can't, make those kinds of judgments for people. But certainly it doesn't hurt to try these things out, see how they can work for you. And I want to get into some of these specifics. Lee, you mentioned meditation. I have some real specific things I'd like to mention about just how and why meditation works. And I think people have misunderstandings about that too. Definitions, fear, anxiety, worry. I'm a little fuzzy on all that as well. And I've noticed that there's different, kinds of anxiety, obviously. One of the types of anxiety I hear a lot from in young people is talking about social anxiety. And I wonder, and I didn't used to hear that much about social anxiety. In the old days, we just call it, some people are shy, but there's a big difference between that and social anxiety. There's a lot of particulars about that. And so I'm wondering if maybe, our internet world, people interacting online and through texting, and there's so many younger people now, especially, who will not answer the phone. They will only reply with texting. And sometimes it's a matter of convenience, but in other cases, it's just this anxiety about direct, real-time, face-to-face communication. So there's a lot of social issues there and technological issues that might be affecting people getting used to these kinds of things. So really, we could go a lot of different directions with this, but maybe we could just talk about how some of these practices have helped us.
I'll jump in on that one because years ago, I used to think I had a fear of flying, and I'd get on airplanes and I'd just feel very, very uncomfortable, very tense. And in a few cases, I had the point where I had to ask the attendants if I could get off the plane. I was feeling so completely panicked by being on the airplane. And I had to fly a lot for my job, so this was quite inconvenient. But one day I realized that what I was feeling wasn't a fear of flying, it was claustrophobia. And so I was getting on the plane, and this feeling that I couldn't get off the plane caused me claustrophobia. And once I understood that, I was able to then, as I would get ready for flying, I could prepare myself for that feeling. I could talk to myself, I could relax my body, get my breath, and get my mind in gear and say, I'm going to feel this, and it's going to happen, and just go with it. It'll end at a certain point in time, and I'll be comfortable flying. And it worked, and I really got to the point where I could enjoy flying. And I mean, the 2 points there, I think, is that one is identifying what you're actually feeling is, I think, very, very important. That, to be able to put a name on it, or to, just recognize, and this is, I think, true of any feeling, is the ability to actually, pay enough attention to it to recognize what it's really telling us. And the second thing is that I did have, I was able to tap into some techniques. I've studied yoga for 30, 40 years now, and I have, I was able to get my body relaxed, get my breathing, but also meditative techniques of really, really being focused on the fact of, not trying to ignore the fear, not trying to get away from it, but just focusing on the feeling itself, letting the feeling happen, and, just giving all of my attention to that. And it's the funny thing is that, doing that causes, eventually it just, is kind of evaporates just by the force of attention. So I think, those are the two points I would really emphasize with fear situations is particularly fear situations that are somewhat irrational. I mean, there also are, obviously this doesn't apply if you've got a really immediate situation where somebody is threatening you with a crowbar or something, but particularly, but so much of our fear these days and anxiety is irrational. It's not specific, very tangible, real situations. It's these kind of vaguer things that really cause us a lot of anxiety. So those are the 2 points that I'd make about ways of dealing with that type of fear.
Yeah, know thyself, that's a big part of a lot of these contemplative practices, getting to understand ourselves and understand what's really going on. You've made 2 points now that have to do with not thinking it was one thing and really subconsciously something else was going on. And I think that the kind of mindfulness techniques that we talk about in the society are very much focused on watching and being attentive to what is going on in our own minds as it arises, and being aware of that, and being more and having more understanding about our inner workings. And then you also made a really great point that I actually had here on my notes too, was about how these understanding yourself, and about how, oh boy, I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought now. I need more focus. Oh, about how knowing about it isn't necessarily because it's not a rational fear. And what I was going to say about that is that a lot of people find themselves in that situation where they absolutely know that it's not productive to worry about X, whatever it is. And even though their rational minds completely understands all of the points that you could tell them why they shouldn't be afraid, or why, it's not productive, or why it's not helpful, or what they can do, none of that intellectual stuff actually changes their feelings. And so there's this wall where they feel like, you can tell me all you want, but I've still got this problem. And I think that wall is what gives people the impression that they have to necessarily then go to something chemical. But that wall can be broken down. It is possible to take the intellectual knowledge and put into place certain practices whereby that intellectual knowledge pierces through the wall and starts to actually have a formative effect on our deeper, instinctive level almost responses. And when people learn how to start putting certain practices in their life that change them on that intuitive level, that's when they really start to see the power of these things, to where you're no longer having to, after the fact, think about it intellectually and then tell yourself this and that, but that your actual natural immediate responses start to shift over time, and you find that you're becoming a new type of person, a different character, a different your personality, and your the way you respond to the world is starting to just shift, and then it becomes easier because you're not having to force yourself. So that's what I think a lot of people haven't seen yet about contemplative practices.
When you bring up the wall, which is what I think a lot of people associate with fear and anxiety, and I know I always did, and you think of a wall as being something physical. And even in our podcast, we throw out a lot of different things, and as you go through life and learn more, you can learn the same things over and over sometimes, but then suddenly one time you'll hear something and it will get to you. And it really was probably less than a month ago that I heard something about fear and anxiety that finally got through to me, especially about that wall. And it was that anxiety, rather than being that wall that you can't get through, is really just a reflection of what's going on in your mind. And your mind is building up that reflection. But just like a reflection that's in water, you identify it and then you can dissipate it like that. And it was one of the first times that it kind of got through to me, oh, that's not even a physical wall. That's just an imaginary wall that you can just walk right through. You just, like Thomas said, identify what it is. And once you've identified it, it's so much easier to deal with.
Something else you mentioned earlier, Lee, about waking up and having anxiety as you wake up. I've noticed that when I am in a state of, what's it called, hypnagogic or whatever, when you're half awake and half asleep.
Yeah.
I've noticed that as I'm in that state, as I'm coming out of a dream or coming out of sleep, that there's something a lot more primal about my brain. I'm much more emotional, and it's almost like there's a certain portion of it, certain modules are like turned off or something. And I think that can tell us a lot about ourselves right at that state. And sometimes I guess a lot of these practices can involve rituals and things where you purposely put yourself into kind of a hypnagogic state or something similar to that. And you start from that, vision quests and things like that, where you can kind of see what comes up when your rational mind isn't trying to control everything. So that's just another example. We mentioned meditation, but there's all these other interesting types of experiences. And there's even some studies now. They've been greatly hindered by the laws, of course, but there's some studies about how different kinds of psychotropic experiences can help people deal with PTSD and anxiety and stress and things like that.
Well, I would wake up at night, and like I said, I could measure my heartbeat, and so I could see that my heart rate was really up when I woke up. In fact, I would even, get warnings. So I went to my doctor, and I was talking with her about it, and it was one of those things where I just thought it was interesting, and I said, can having a dream really raise your heart rate, or am I having a bad dream because my, heart rate is going up? And she said, no, having bad dreams can cause your heart rate to go up. Well, that was another one of those things that once I identified that, it doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen now, I just sit up and think, okay, I had a bad dream. I just need to sit here, breathe, calm down and everything, and it will pass. And it's gotten a lot better. You
were just running from dinosaurs or something a few
minutes ago. It was that fight or flight reflex there, yeah.
So, go ahead, Thomas.
Well, just this will take things in a little different direction here, but I retired about 6-7 months ago, and I've had fairly stressful jobs for the last many, many years, and I would very often wake up with, stress, and I'd have, wake up in the middle of the night with, all this stuff going through my mind about work and everything. And I really realized just how, the fact is that the modern world is not a very healthy place. We were, evolutionarily, we were not designed for a world with this much stimulation and this much stress. And so it's just amazing how much calmer. I never wake up now in the middle of the night feeling anxiety or stress. And, it's just, work caused so much of that kind of thing. And I think this is true for an awful lot of people, is that it's just, the workplace is not that healthy of a place to be. And so I think we really have to do a lot to protect ourselves as much, from the kind of world we live in, a world that we're just commuting from work to home can be filled with stresses and really. So that's a little different thing. But I think the whole thing about trying to get some control of our own, get some, these kind of taking care of these things and not using alcohol or drugs to do it. And particularly, there's billboards up and I go by them and say, you've had a bad day. And the idea is, okay, you've had a bad day. The way to deal with it is sit down and get drunk. Well, that's a pretty unhealthy way of dealing with, because it doesn't solve anything. It makes you feel better for a little while, but then you're back to square one. So I think these, there are internal techniques that really can help a lot. It would be, but on the other side is also making choices about, the work you're going to do and trying to plan a career that is as healthy as you can make it. But I think, we really do have to protect ourselves from the nature of the society we live in these days. So that's just another direction here.
Yeah, there's definitely, I've got a friend who has always had a lot of stress and anger from his workplace. And I remember when I first went from college to my first job, and my first real, career type job, and I was at a really big company. And it was a real culture shock because I naively thought that the way things happened in corporate America were a lot more logical than they really are. I thought I could go into a situation and there would be a problem and I could say, hey, there's this problem, and I could address it and everybody go, oh yeah, that's a good solution. And everything's improved. And then those silly things don't happen anymore. And I was disillusioned of that. And I came to this point where I, just as a self-defense mechanism, had to kind of be a little nihilistic about it, or at least a little hands-off about it. I had to say, well, corporate America has certain things that you get in there, and there's certain, maybe it's any human institution really, that once it gets so big and so complex that there's all these competing personal interests, and that's when I started to learn things about, maybe listen to people more, maybe be more attentive to people's emotions. I used to be because I came from a background of very much paying attention to logic and philosophy and rationality and all this stuff. So I would be kind of dismissive of concerns about people's feelings and things like that when I was young. And, like, oh, that will get over your feelings. This is what's correct, and I wouldn't say that, of course, but, that was kind of my attitude. And so then, just learning how to navigate things like that really helped a lot. But I tell people now, or like my wife, for example, would say something about something that got held up at work because somebody did something really bad, and then the project is messed up, and I would say, oh, that's really unfortunate for the shareholders. Like, you don't own that company. That's somebody else's company. You're still getting your paycheck. So you got to kind of keep, because it's real easy to fall into these roles where you just play this role. You're supposed to be this person. You've taken on this little set of agenda items, and it's almost like a role-playing game. You've just decided to become this role-playing set of goals and agendas and everything, and you can get very lost in that, very caught up in that. And so a big part of spiritual practices very often is about having that big picture view, getting out of that little picture and sticking your head up and seeing what is really important and what's not important, and what are my priorities, and that sort of thing. I think that helps a lot with the work situations.
I think another technique too, you can have a job that you actually like that can cause stress. You can have a job that you don't like that can cause stress. You can, especially if you are your own boss, causes a lot of stress too. But in previous episodes of the podcast, we've talked about the having self-compassion and everything too. And that's a really effective technique for dealing with the anxiety and fear and the stress that work brings up.
I just wanted to go back to something you said, Daniel, is for people, who are married, it is so, and particularly if you're both working, it's so important to be a shoulder for, your mate to, to just be able to dump on for a while. Well, I had, my wife came home yesterday, and she in the last 2 days has just had horrible days. She just was, at the point where she was just going to quit. I mean, and she's only 3 months from retirement. She's, I can't make it 3 more months. I just, and I really, didn't want to have to listen to all that, but it's like, yes, this is what we have to do. I've got to listen. And I know I used to do that too, where I'd come home. So that's one thing that people who are, either have really good friends or who are married, that can be a real help, but it only if you're really willing to listen, because otherwise, if you actually, aren't sympathetic, you can really add to, your spouse's stress by the very fact that you're not willing to really give them what they need, which is to not to tell them what they should think or that they shouldn't be feeling this way, but that to just listen and hear what's going on and sympathize and be, you don't want to solve. That's one of those things I learned very on, is it's trying to suggest the solution is very often not the right kind of thing to do in that situation. That just listening is what's really important, and sympathizing.
It took me more than half my life to learn that it's not about, oh, you just need to do this, problem solved. Okay. But
we men like to solve problems, and that comes very natural, is to be able to solve a problem and get away from it. But that's not always in relationships. That's not necessarily the right approach to things.
But that gets back to Lee's point about we can use that very same process on ourselves and have love for ourselves and treat ourselves right and think, what would I say to myself if it was my best friend? What advice would I give them if they were in this situation? And you take that advice for yourself. And, so it's like this also touches on something that the point that you brought up, Lee, about things we need to do sometimes are not about figuring out how to handle a situation, but when it's the right time to get out of that situation. And that touches back on something you said, Thomas, about your jobs and, when a job isn't worth it and that sort of thing. And what that makes me think about is the fact that, all of these various traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Stoicism or these other kinds of philosophies and everything, they have kind of this ideal sage that they talk about as an example of how a wise person would think or act or evaluate things or what have you. And that's it's a perfect ideal to serve as a model. But in reality, we're all students and we're all just trying to make our progress as best as we can. And none of us are enlightened beings. And so we have the reality of the situation that we only have made so much progress at any given time in our life. And there's always something left to be made. And so we have to deal with life as it is. And so, maybe if you were the perfect enlightened sage, you could handle any job and just be like a judo master and things would just roll off of you and you'd be fine. You go home at the end of the day and, you'd be perfectly fine. And the more progress we make, the closer we do get to that over time in our life. We handle things better and better and better. But the reality is that at any given time, you're in a situation and you may not be up to that task. And so then you have to deal with the reality and say, okay, well, I'm obviously not handling this, so let me be kind to myself and protect myself by moving away from these conditions that are not healthy or that I can't handle, or that are causing me more harm than, and I don't yet have the enlightenment I need to handle this. And so that's very important, of course. But again, that all comes back to know thyself.
Those old sages never had to work in the modern workplace. They could chop wood and carry water, but there's something about the modern workplace that I think would mess up the minds of any sage. And that's something because I feel I'm pretty good at that kind of stuff. And I just had to finally realize, that when I got home from work, even on a good day, I had a period of, I just had to give myself time to let all this stuff kind of bubble up and get out of my system, because it's mostly about personalities. I mean, it's people, people are the hell of jobs, actually. It's not the work, but it's the people stuff that really, I think, causes all those kinds of feelings that get left, and that you just have to, so I just learned I needed to get home. Very often I'd take a walk and, a 3-mile hike, and I'd have it all sorted out, and I could then relax, and I could be perfectly calm. And actually it's kind of interesting, because I think walking is one of the greatest therapeutic things in the world. And it's something that is just lost. People don't walk anymore. And, it's not only that it gives you the physical outlet, but it also gives you a mental. It's a nice pace for you to be walking and thinking at the same time. Of course, for a lot of people, and I think, probably for women in particular, there's a lot of fear associated with being out in the world in certain situations. And so walking for some people is fear, unfortunately creates fear. But if you have a nice, good place to walk, I think walking is one of the great therapeutic things we can get into.
I'm actually reading a book right now called The Nature Fix. And in it, the author actually goes through a lot of scientific data and everything that shows that walking, and especially walking in an area that has trees rather than walking like through a field or something like that, really has physical and mental benefits to people. And that they're starting to figure that out. And the Japanese have these, what they call forest retreats, which are basically places where the people just go to, take walks. They put labyrinths and things there because they know how beneficial it is to walk out in nature like that. So all of that's very true.
Yeah, what a wonderful practice. So, we mentioned a lot of these practices. I mentioned earlier, too, that I wanted to say some specific things about meditation. That's kind of like a biggie we always mention, but I think there's a lot of things that people think about meditation before they've started it, or at the early stages they started it, that may not be exactly what we mean. So I think what people think meditation is, when they hear about reducing stress and things, they think it's like, well, let me sit here for a little while and I'll have quiet and I'll clear my mind and I'll just kind of rest and relax and just sort of, take a break, and then that'll relieve my stress. And then I go, okay, I had that, and I had some stress relief during that time for doing that. And that can certainly be true, that can work. But I don't think that's the powerful kind of stress relief when we talk about mindfulness-based stress reduction. There's other interesting ways that meditation, I think, helps. And so I think one of the ways is that as we start to practice focusing our attention on one thing and allowing the rest of our mind to become quiet, it does several things. First of all of our various little subconscious thoughts that are rising in our minds all the time. They're kind of like pebbles being thrown in the water. So if the ocean is very disturbed, like in a storm, you're not going to notice those ripples from those pebbles. But if you calm the mind, it becomes like a still lake, and then those pebbles become noticeable, and that's when you start to be able to see the things arising in your mind more clearly. And so you start to become practiced at that, so that when you're in a situation and things start to happen, you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off, you have an eyeball inside your mind that's now looking at your own thoughts. That didn't happen before I started meditating. And so what happens then is it's the effect when you're not meditating that your life is now changed because of your time practicing meditation. So that's one example. Another example is that as you start to witness experience without judgments and labels, you start to see what direct experience it can be. You can, even when you're on a nature walk, for example, you can go into kind of a meditative state where you're not thinking, you're just experiencing. And that ability to do that you hone through practice of meditation starts to make you realize just how artificial the labels and wrappers and judgments and categorizations we put on things are. And those labels, those stories we tell ourselves, are very often a source of our stress and anxiety. Anyway, I just wanted to touch on some of that. I know a lot of us here, including listeners, will already know some of that, but we have a wide audience, and I wanted to just mention some of those things as a teaser for those people interested in starting to get into meditation.
Yeah, I think meditation is extremely helpful for all of these things, but I do think that, like as I was talking about coming home from work and being stressed, is that to get to the point where I could get my mind quieted down, I had to work with my body. Either through something like walking, and sometimes walking and physical exercise or yoga or something. And the stress, because I always found work stress really was stress in the body. It was in the mind too, but if I could get my body back to a certain level of relaxation and calmness, then I could, really work with my mind. So I think then it was easy to meditate. But I found, like, to go straight from work to meditation, it was not something and I'm pretty good at meditation. I spent a lot of time doing it, but I needed to work a process to get to the point where then I could, really could. Although I've always meditated in the morning, and that really helped a lot. It kept me calm for many hours going into work. Gave me a really good base for going into work. But I found no matter what, full day's work, 8 hours of work, and no matter how I would come home and you talk about that pool of water. Well, my mind was like a pool that had gravel being thrown into it. It took a while to get all those ripples to reach the shore. And but it's a wonderful thing to know that you can, you can work your way back to that kind of calmness that, that's just it makes it all so much more bearable to know that if that's possible, that you're not stuck with a riled up mind or an angry mind, or that you have the power within you to do something about it. And that's what I think, if people who don't understand that, who haven't really tasted that, it's just something that I hope they can learn, because to know that you have the power, it might take time. It's not like you dropping a pill or something and it's just going to happen. But if you've learned these things, you can get back to the point where you feel really, really strong, really centered, really good. And that's what these practices can do for people.
One other technique or tool that I find useful too when I've got a problem and I've got anxiety because I don't have a solution or so, is journaling. And, sometimes it's just like magic. I can sit and write the same thing over. I don't know what to do about this. I don't know what to do about this, and then suddenly the solution just comes right to you as you're writing or so. So journaling has been good for those particular types of issues.
I think the journaling is that principle of helping to identify what's really going on. As you sit back and write, you start to understand, oh, this is what's going on here. It gives you a way of doing that. That's probably in some ways, well, some people can do that without the journal, but I think journaling really helps you to slow down, and seeing an idea on paper is kind of interesting, because all of a sudden it's now not something floating around in your mind. It's actually an object on the paper. And I find very often just putting an idea on paper has a really interesting effect, much different from just carrying it in my head.
Yeah, that is a great point. And, Lee, that I'm glad you brought up journaling, because that's another great practice. And there's, just like with meditation, there's a lot of different kinds of journaling, different ways to do it. Like a free form kind of creative journaling can, help us see what's in our minds, like we've described here. There's also like a stoic journaling where you're actually taking the lessons you've been reading about, that intellectual stuff that doesn't seem to make any difference when you're having a certain feeling, and you're going over it, you're reviewing your day. How did that compare to these virtues or wisdom teachings that I'm trying to compare? And as you do that, you start to condition yourself to think in those terms. And that's one of the ways that you break through that wall to where the intellectual can kind of come down and start shaping our personality. And so it's almost like a study or a self-review, and that's a whole different kind of journaling. And they're all good. They're good for different ways and different reasons. Just like loving kindness meditation is different than breathing meditation, mindful, or walking meditation, or what have you. But yeah, journaling is a great thing. And I think what all of these things are pointing to, whether you're talking about walking or journaling or meditation or any of these other kinds of practices that we mentioned, I think the first step, I'm thinking about like the beginner, right, on these kinds of things. And I think the first step is just getting out of that feeling of just going from thing to thing to thing to thing all day until it's time to go to sleep. And that's what a lot of us are in, because, our time is crunched. We have obligations to family and job and all these things, and we're traveling, we're doing these, we're going back and forth to work. And so I think for a lot of people that don't have what you would call a regular practice, I would recommend just starting small and easy and just taking a simple moment each day. It can be in the morning. It can be in the evening when you want to wind down. It can be at lunch break. It can be whenever. But just starting to affect your schedule. Think about if somebody were watching you throughout the day and they wrote down everything you did throughout that day. If you're going to have a practice that can begin to condition you to be wiser and calmer and happier and all that, there should be something on that schedule that's changed. There should be something you're doing that you didn't do before, or not doing that you did do before. But carve out some time, because time is your currency. Start with just a little time. And even if it's just time to sit there and do nothing, just relax your brain, that can begin to create a space in which you can start to build a practice.
That I absolutely agree. I mean, it's so wonderful to you got to start somewhere, and we can only tell people who've been doing this a long time can only just give testimony of the value of it over that it starts out. It's you can seem for months like you're not making any progress, but if you keep at it, you really can get there. But a simple kind of practice that, again, relating to times when I had really stressful work and I'd have insomnia, I wouldn't be able to sleep. And one of the things I learned was to always get my mind, get this stuff out of my mind before I tried to go to sleep. Otherwise, I'd inevitably wake up at 2 a.m. and I'd have to deal with it. So sitting down, often with a piece of paper, writing stuff, saying, just recognizing what was going on until, it was clear. And I could say, okay, there's nothing really bothering me. If there was some insult that I suffered during the day, I can look at it and say, okay, that bothered me, but it's done. Let's go on. If there's something, I have to do, I can have it written down. I can have my little list, which say, okay, I can forget about it. It's on my to-do list. I'll take care of it tomorrow. And that was by far the most important thing I learned about, getting just being able to sleep through the night, was to try to get to sleep with a fairly calm. And if I could go on beyond that and actually do some meditation, that would even be better. But if people can give themselves at least that much, they'll have a little slowing down, and so that's just another technique. But insomnia is a little different topic. But insomnia often is related to fear and stress and such things, and I know a lot of people do have that problem. And I think that's just one suggestion I'd give to anybody who is experiencing insomnia is, take time before you go to sleep to clean out your mind, figure out what's going to wake you up, and get it dealt with before you try to go to sleep.
Yeah, that's great advice. The carving out of time, and also if you start to set aside that time and then you wonder, okay, what should I do? What can I try? And then how do I do it? I looked at reading as a practice. So setting aside time to read, that'll bring you in fuel, for your practice. That'll give you things to think about or things you might want to try. You'll start to learn more about how these works. You could read about meditation. You could read about different techniques for different ways people have relieved their own anxieties or dealt with fears. What I used to do in the early days of my practice was I'd wake up in the morning, like really early, before I really had to wake up so that I'd have enough time. And then I would combine a kind of physical and mental thing. I'd get dressed in my workout clothes, and we had a park nearby. And we were living in an apartment at the time. So I'd go out, it's still dark. I'd walk over to the park, and I'd do like a kind of a brisk walking. And at one point I'd end up somewhere in the park, this particular place with a bench, and I'd have my book with me, and I'd sit, and then I would do a meditation, just a few minutes. At the time, I don't think I could do very long, because I was new at it. And I did a few minutes of meditation. And then once I did that, my mind was calmer. And then I cracked open the book, and I set a timer, and I read a little bit each day. And after I read for just a few minutes there, I would close that up, and I'd go back to my brisk walking again, and then I'd get home and do my shower and then go to work. And I had my walking, I had my meditation, I had my exercise, and that really prepped me for my whole day. But I had that regular thing that I always did, and I did that for a long time, and that's how I built up a lot of practice in the early days of my meditation. But that's just one example. You can set yourself a little plan like that, and you can change it after you see what works for you and what doesn't, and what you want to try. But having that reading element as part of your practice, is thinking of it as a practice, if you're very new at this stuff, that can really bring in a lot of fresh ideas.
Yeah, I always value books that and I never am trying to get them finished, that that can serve me that way for a long period of time. And I've got I actually have a list that I probably would someday. We should have a list of, maybe there's a place on our site where we could have a list of, really good books for that kind of thing. I found one of the books that I've, over years and years was various versions of the Tao Te Ching that I would come back to, and just as a morning meditation and particularly a version I have that it has a great commentary on it. It's written by Ellen Chen, her translation and her commentary based on early Chinese commentary. But I've read it, I've gone through that many, many times, and each time though, I'd come back with new. So that was I found a particularly good book for that kind of sometimes it was very direct, and sometimes it was learning, it wasn't really applicable directly, but it was just learning, about that tradition. And, but
yeah,
I've had quite a number of other books too.
Yeah. And then, Lee, you mentioned The Nature Fix earlier. We occasionally are always mentioning different books here. I want to let people know too about, if you go to our website, scroll down to the bottom, there's the SNS shop, and we have an Amazon store, and the things that we choose to put in that Amazon store are really our recommended reading list. So you can look through that, and you don't have to necessarily get them there. They could be available in your library, but you could at least use that list as a recommended reading thing. We also have book reviews. I'd like to have a lot more reviews in there right now. We don't have that many. But
where is that list?
Yeah, if you go to snsociety.org and then you scroll down to the bottom, there's SNS shop. You click on that, and then there's an Amazon shop link, so the SNS Amazon store. And so people can see that. And then, of course, shameless plug here, but the Society also publishes Exploring Spiritual Naturalism, years 1 through 3, and it's got a collection of our articles that we put out, all kind of organized in a more systematic way than you would get on a blog. So that can have some really wonderful stuff in it for the beginner especially. But even not, because none of us are masters in all of the different traditions, and it's pretty eclectic. But we've talked about a lot of the different aspects that these practices do that I think are central to addressing anxiety, fear, and worry. They help you understand yourself. They can help you to learn how to hand over things that are not within your control, and not, Christians call it like handing things over to God, but we naturalists refer to it as just understanding what is in your control and what is not in your control, and really internalizing that, Another thing is it can teach us how to, these contemplative practices can teach you how to live in the moment, to be right here, right now, instead of always somewhere else in your mind, always distracted, how to hone your attention and place it where you want it, when you want it. And then we already talked about meditation. So, there's a wealth of stuff that we don't even have time to get to everything, but those are some of the biggies. And I think we're coming close to the end of our time. Lee, did you have anything you wanted to say closing us out of this?
Well, just to bring it back full circle, we had talked about, when you're young, you have certain anxieties. When you get married, have a family, other things. And then as you get older, your anxieties and fears morph into something else. But hopefully what we've done today is kind of give people an idea of the different tools that they can use, because your fears and anxieties will change as you go through life, but the tools that you use, whatever you find that works for you, you should be able to use in, subsequent years and as your life goes on, and keep those same tools and use them.
Yep.
Great. And Thomas, did you have any closing words?
Nope. I think I've said what I need to say.
Okay. And yeah, that's the thing I would say closing, is just as long as you're setting aside some time for continued learning and growth, then it will happen. But you gotta like put your money where your mouth is. You know, you gotta dedicate some time to it, to yourself. Love yourself by spending time with yourself, and you'll see that these things you'll grow over time like a tree. So thank you for listening, everyone. And if you haven't heard our other episodes, there's plenty of other episodes where we address all kinds of different aspects of spiritual naturalism. And check us out at snsociety.org. There's a little link there for the podcast, and each podcast has its own page with comments, and you can leave comments there. So feel free to join us next time. And in the meantime, if you're not a member of the society, please go to snsociety.org and click the membership link. We'd love to have you as a member, as a part of our community. It means that you'll get the newsletter, which includes all the latest in spiritual naturalism, updates and announcements, that kind of thing. Until next time, goodbye and take care.
This program was sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society. Learn more and become a member at spiritualnaturalistsociety.org. Our music was composed by John Clemisrude. Please share our program and join us next time on Spiritual Naturalism Today.